My name is Father Aaron Michka. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here and also a Holy Cross priest. We have the great pleasure of welcoming two scholars to speak today. First will be Professor China Scherz. China Scherz is a medical anthropologist and an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia. She is the author of Having People, Having Heart, Charity, Sustainable Development, and Problems of Dependence in Central Uganda from the University of Chicago Press, 2014, as well as Higher Powers, Alcohol, and After in Uganda's capital city, University of California Press, forthcoming February 2024. She is currently engaged in an NSF-funded collaborative ethnographic study of faith-based approaches to opioid use disorders in Appalachia. As a respondent, we have the pleasure of welcoming Monique Wubbenhorst. Dr. Monique Wubbenhorst is a public policy fellow with the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture and a practicing obstetrician, gynecologist with more than 20 years experience in international health and policy and research in women's health. She joined the faculty at Duke University School of Medicine and the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2003 before serving as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Global Health at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Welcome to you both. First, we'll hear from Professor Scherz.
Thank you so much, Father Aaron, and thank you all for being here today. Really looking forward to this. Talk of demon drink and addiction as a slavery from within were central to Victorian addiction discourse. Clinicians in the 1950s complained that their patients misconstrued addictions as ego aliens, metaphoric monkey on their back. Such metaphors have remained part of our modern lexicon with talk of inner demons and hungry ghosts. Yet, when Pentecostals in Uganda speak of the pain and suffering of addiction as being caused by a spirit, they are not speaking metaphorically. For them, addictions are not like spirit possession, or slavery for that matter, in the sense that they have metaphorically lost control of their agency to another. To be addicted is literally to be under the control of a being that comes from outside the self. The same is true for Ugandan Basamize, who engage in forms of mediumship and worship known in Uganda as kusamira. Yet for these Basamize, the task is not about deliverance, but is rather about finding ways to better engage with the spirits through recognizing their prior obligations and moving into more productive relationships and care and reciprocity. Yet, despite all their differences, both groups see alcohol-related problems as resulting from the actions of external spiritual forces. Where they differ, and here they differ strongly, is with regard to the moral valence of these external spirits and what ought to be done about them. This afternoon, I want to consider how our understandings of both addiction and ethics might be changed by thinking with these more porous and relational understandings of personhood and subjectivity. To do this, I will draw on materials collected through a collaborative ethnographic study of alcohol use and recovery in Uganda that I've been working on with my Ugandan collaborators, George Mpanga and Sarah Namarembe, since 2015. While many people outside of Uganda might not immediately think of substance use disorders if they were asked to name the most serious challenges facing this small East African country, the World Health Organization estimates that Ugandan drinkers have one of the highest per capita consumption rates in the world at 23.7 liters of pure alcohol per year. For comparison, the estimated per capita consumption rate among American drinkers is 13.3 and 22.3 among Russian drinkers. Over the course of 4 years, George, Sarah, and I carried out our collaborative ethnographic fieldwork with a small group of Ugandans working to leave problematic forms of alcohol use behind. Given the relatively recent introduction of Western ideas of alcoholism and addiction in Uganda, most of these people used other therapeutic resources, including herbal emetic therapies, engagements with the Lubale spirits, and forms of deliverance and spiritual warfare practiced in Pentecostal and charismatic Catholic churches. A major portion of our work has been an effort to follow 16 people who attempted to stop drinking using one or more of these therapeutic pathways over the course of several years following that attempt. The results of this work will soon be available in the form of a book entitled Higher Powers, Alcohol and After in Uganda's Capital City, which will be published by the University of California Press in this coming February. It will also be available on their website as an open access PDF for anybody that wants to download it, a goal that was really important to George and Sarah and I as we attempted to make this work accessible in Uganda. While the 4 therapeutic pathways that we describe in Higher Powers differ from one another in substantial ways, they all present challenges to the prevailing biomedical model of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease, and offer alternative modes of understanding substance use and personhood that can have profound consequences for the forms of life and sociality that follow an attempt to stop drinking. By exploring the affordances of these alternate ways of describing and engaging with problem drinking, we hope to contribute to a reconceptualization of addiction and recovery by showing what forms of life might be possible given other ways of understanding and approaching these problems. As I will discuss today, engaging in this work of reconceptualization requires us to suspend some basic assumptions about personhood and subjectivity. In both the churches and in the shrines, understandings of problem drinking and its resolution involve an understanding of the person as relational, passionable, permeable, and exposed. Setting aside the subtle differences between them, these various heuristics overlap and intermingle and have all been used to describe a vision of the person that emphasizes the role that people, substances, and spiritual beings play in their constitution. While conflicts between the groups of practitioners I'll describe today often stem from ontological disagreements about the beings that exist, their natures, and the relationships between them, there is a common sense of agreement among these practitioners that the forces and beings involved in the process of recovery and in other forms of ethical transformation exceed secular categories and understandings of bounded or buffered selves. Philosopher Charles Taylor has helpfully described a similar distinction between what he terms the buffered self and the pre-modern porous self. For Taylor, the porous self sees the self as necessarily vulnerable to the influence of agencies and forces that lie beyond its borders. By contrast, Taylor writes, the buffered self can form an ambition of disengaging from whatever is beyond the boundary and giving its own autonomous order to its life. While I want to resist the pre-modern distinction, West-Rest dichotomy that Taylor's work could be seen to support, I do find this contrast between the buffered self and the porous self allows us to better understand why prevailing models of both ethical transformation and addiction fall short in terms of their capacity to help us understand cases like the Ugandan Pentecostals and Basamize that I will discuss today. Let's first attend to models of ethical transformation. If the stories that I were going to share with you this afternoon were focused on describing a series of daily practices through which people work to retrain themselves into a habitual way of being in the world, we would have a clear sense of where to look in the anthropological and philosophical literatures for tools for analysis. Over the past 15 years, anthropologists studying processes of ethical transformation have focused on moments of evaluative reflection and intentional projects of self-cultivation. These scholars have all used models either derived from Aristotle and the Stoics that have filtered down into contemporary anthropological theory through the works of Pierre Bourdieu and Michel Foucault. They have drawn on these models to explore the ways in which people take up exercises of self-cultivation in an effort to align their desires, habits, and actions with various moralities and understandings of the good. Yet, While this focus on intentional action and reflective thought that characterizes this approach have provided helpful correctives to overly determinist frameworks in the study of morality and social life more generally, it has come with certain limitations. Specifically, in an effort to better incorporate freedom, deliberation, and projects of intentional self-making, scholars have tended to background other aspects of ethical life and personhood, which are less easily controlled. Among these less controllable aspects are various divinities and other spiritual beings that often appear in people's narratives of ethical transformation. Indeed, the possibility that such beings are involved in collectivities capable of shaping the self has received only occasional attention. This lack of focus is surprising given the explicit articulations of divine action as an explanation for personal moral transformations, as well as the current disciplinary interest in questions of ontology. In addition to the ways in which the stories I'll share with you today challenge these ways of thinking about ethical transformation, they also present problems for ways of thinking about substance use disorders that differ strongly from biomedical models. Since the 1990s, clinicians, policymakers, and members of the public in many countries have increasingly been taught to think about addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease, the CRBD model. Under the CRBD model, addictions are understood to be problems of individual biology that result from the more and less permanent effects of drugs and alcohol on a person's neural circuitry. This model both diverges from earlier stigmatizing models of addiction centered on the individual weakness of will, and also replace earlier clinical attempts to cure addiction through a variety of physical and chemical techniques. Importantly, for the purposes of this talk, the CRBD model casts addictions as problems that can be managed but never cured. And so, while the idea of addiction, of disease might free a person from the stigmatizing model of the weakness of will, the focus on chronicity certifies that one is consigned to a life of inescapable repetition, and this too may be a heavy burden to bear. While carrying forward aspects of a research program that took off in the middle of the 20th century, the CRBD model did not fully coalesce in America until the 1990s. In his seminal 1997 paper, Addiction is a Brain Disease and It Matters, Alan Leshner, who was at that time the director of NIDA, defined the CRBD model and argued for the urgency of its acceptance by policymakers and the general public, for whom, he said, the idea that addiction is a chronic relapsing disease of the brain is a totally new concept. In this article, Leshner argued that 2 decades of neuroscientific and behavioral research had shown that, quote, prolonged drug use causes pervasive changes in brain function that persist long after an individual stops taking the drug, making the addicted brain distinctly different from the non-addicted brain. As opposed to earlier models, which Leshner saw as stigmatizing drug users or focusing on the need to help people through withdrawal, the CRBD model sought to reframe addiction as a chronic illness. Given the long-lasting effects of drug use on brain metabolic activity, receptor availability, gene expression, and responsiveness to environmental cues, Leshner argued that the successful drug treatment could result in, he quote, a significant decrease in drug use and prolonged periods of abstinence with only occasional relapses, but that the permanent cessation of compulsive drug seeking was an unrealistic goal. Since this time, the CRBD model has been the guiding force of most NIDA-funded addiction research in the United States and has been a model at the center of many landmark articles and special issues. NIDA's call for broad public acceptance of the CRBD model in the United States spread beyond the pages of scientific journals with talks of hijacked brains and fluorescent images of fMRI screens flashing across American televisions and informing the curricula on addiction in American classrooms. Another vision of chronicity has been circulating in the United States since the 1930s through the work of the mutual aid fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous. Those of you familiar with AA might at first find the arguments that I'm going to make about the role of spiritual experiences in processes of recovery resonant with AA's long-held position that sobriety can only be achieved through spiritual awakening and engagement with God. Yet, Despite Alcoholics Anonymous' caveat that this quote-unquote conscious contact with God was with a God as we understood him, the vision of God in AA is actually quite specific and quite different from the role that spiritual forces play in many of the stories that have been shared with George, Sarah, and I over the past 4 years. The higher power in AA, and the use of the singular seems important here, is an always benevolent force whose primary role is to strengthen the will of the alcoholic who has become powerless over alcohol so that he can live a sober life, despite his unchangeable condition. While these images of a singular will-strengthening God and the unchangeable nature of addiction are present in Uganda as well in certain spaces, they are, as a pair, only a small part of the ways that addictions and higher powers, plural, are imagined and engaged. This is particularly true for the Pentecostals and Basamize involved in our study. Ugandan Pentecostals and Basamize attempting to overcome alcohol-related problems are less focused on asking God to strengthen their wills than they are in using rituals to directly engage with the spiritual beings that are impacting their lives. In short, it is less about making oneself strong enough to overcome a permanently determined state than it is about attempting to deal with the determining spiritual forces directly through ritual means. In the stories of the people involved in either spiritual warfare or kusamira that I'll share with you in a moment, we find a model of personhood and agentive action in which people's actions are influenced by forces that are conceptualized as external and direct. In some cases, these influences are also thought to be changeable through prayer and other ritual work, and this opens up a wide range of possible futures that are foreclosed in other models of addiction. While both secular and religious scholars might quietly scoff at the accounts of Ugandan Pentecostals and Basamize, in this talk, I want to explore the affordances of these other ways of viewing and experiencing addiction and recovery. While the idioms of bondage, dedication, and possession are at times severe, I argue that they contain within them concepts and practices that point away from a model of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease and towards some possibility of release. To provide a sense of how these alternate models of conceptualizing and engaging with addiction play out, I want to spend some time now thinking about the stories of two people that we've been spending time with over the course of the past 4 years. Daniela. Daniela is an impeccably dressed, well-educated woman in her early 30s. You can often hear her coming down the hall by the click of her high heels and the swish of her full skirts. Daniela spends most of her time at Pastor John's church. Pastor John's is a large Christian fellowship in one of Kampala's many suburbs, hosting more than 18,000 congregants on a daily basis. While many people simply come for overnight prayers on Friday evenings or to listen to Pastor John's teachings during the day, others stay for weeks or even years at a time, placing their suitcases and jerry cans for carrying water in stacks in the large gathering halls. Daniela herself spent over 2 years sleeping at Pastor John's after being referred to the church by a friend. When she first arrived, she had come to pray for a visa so she could start her life over again in another country. At that time, Daniela was drinking very heavily. She had started drinking during her last year of secondary school. She started slowly, but by the time she reached university, there was little she felt she could do without first taking a drink of the potent distilled spirit waraji. She would pack it to class, serve it to friends, study while drinking, discuss while drinking. She was drinking in taxis, at home, cooking, washing. She said she was rarely without her bottle. Over time, alcohol started to create problems for her, and she found that she could not avoid drinking even when she knew she should. She missed job interviews or arrived drunk. Old friends were embarrassed to be seen with her. Her fiancé tried to help her stop, but eventually he left her too. When Daniela arrived in Pastor John's, she found that the teaching was very different from what she had expected. She loved the ways the pastors taught about forgiveness, anger, desperation, and frustration. Over time, Daniela came to think that even if she did go abroad, she would gain nothing. And so she decided to wait for God to change her, thinking that only then would she gain something in her life. She was still drinking at this time, but no one ever sent her away from church. She would come to church drunk to listen to the sermons and then go back to her drinking. But over time, she settled there and began to listen to this teaching with more seriousness. Eventually, in 2015, she decided to follow Pastor John's advice to approach the altar of grace and mercy with boldness, to tell God that she was tired of drinking. In prayer, she said, "You know what, God? I didn't want to become born again, but I came here. God, my life is a mess because of A, B, C, D. I lost everything because of alcohol. I have discovered that I can't leave it on my own. You say, 'Come to me, you who are weary, and I shall carry the burden for you.' I don't want money. I don't want a husband. I want you to change me, to give me a new heart, and put your spirit in me." She stayed in church and cried to God for 10 days, praying and fasting. On the 10th day of the fast, Pastor John was on the pulpit. It was around 2 a.m. Daniela had been crying and praying for God to change her, and Pastor John began to speak, addressing no one in particular. He said, "You girl, you are here, and you feel like something is always asking you for alcohol, and you cannot contain it. You cannot contain it because it is not you. It is a spirit. Come up to the pulpit here, and I will pray for you, for today is your day." Even that day, Daniela had been drinking alone at home before coming to church, but she went up, and Pastor John prayed for her. The church was full to capacity, but she was not afraid of anyone. Daniela says that as Pastor John prayed, she felt something heavy moving from her toes upward, and that it went out of her, and that on this same day, God visited her in a dream. In the dream, God came in the form of Pastor John. In the dream, she was very dirty and tired, and in the dream, Pastor John looked at her. He did not touch her, but he looked at her, and the more he looked at her, the more she became clean. Her clothes began to change too, and she saw herself transforming into a different person. When she woke up, she felt very happy and had no desire to drink. This was 8 years ago. 2 years after this experience of deliverance, she started serving at the church by voluntarily checking people's bags at the security desk, and did this diligently for 2 months from Monday to Saturday. After these 2 months, she was given an opportunity to work at the church radio. While she didn't have any experience in radio presenting, she was asked to present the early morning program. In 2018, Daniela met a man at a church-organized singles gathering, and the two married several months later. Sumuju began drinking when he was 15, taking a small bottle to be filled at an informal Waraji distillery near his home, lying to the distillers and saying that he had been sent by his father. His uncles advised his father to attend to the Lubale spirits that they believed lay behind his drinking, but at the urging of his stepmother, who Sumuju believed to be resentful of his possible spiritual gifts, his father refused to address the problem. Sumuju ultimately left home and went to live with a distant relative in Kampala. This relative, Jaja Kasumba, is the leader of a community of people who participate in Kusamira. While Sumuju was glad to find a home away from his stepmother, he continued drinking, fighting in bars, and getting fired from every job he found. One day, while riding his bicycle, Sumuju got in an accident. During the long period of convalescence that followed the accident, Sumuju started questioning himself about his life and where his problems were coming from. He went to Jaja Kasumba to consult him, and Jaja Kasumba began to counsel him about his drinking and its possible spiritual causes. With the help of the Lubale spirits who possess him during divinations, Jaja Kasumba used Kauri divination to consult with Sumuju's ancestral spirits to discover the source of the problem. The spirits explained that Sumuju had two opposing Lubale in him, Chiwanuka and Bamoyana. Jaja Kasumba told Sumuju that Chiwanuka is a very good and powerful spirit who does not drink, but that Chiwanuka had sent another spirit, Bamoyana, to make Sumuju drink in ways that would ruin his life to punish him for his neglect. The spirit said that Sumuju must satisfy both Bamoyana by making an offering of alcohol and Chiwanuka by assembling a kit for him, including a long white tunic, a piece of bark cloth, a gourd, a stick, and a bag of money. Through these dual efforts, Sumuju could effectively be relieved of Bamoyana's negative influences on him and come into a beneficial relationship with Chiwanuka. After a long delay and many other signs and dreams, which I will not attend to here, Sumuju eventually relented and followed the instructions the spirits had given to him. He bought the necessary things and began to look for further instructions in dreams. Soon after assembling the kit, Sumuju stopped drinking. and other things in his life began to change as well. Family members that he had lost touch with surfaced in truly miraculous ways, and he received an offer to work in a lucrative job in South Sudan, managing 2 trucks delivering agricultural supplies. Before leaving for South Sudan, Sumuju left his Lubale kit with his best friend, instructing him to keep it well and agreeing to send him a little money each week on his phone in exchange for his help. Things were fine for a while, but one morning the friend who was keeping the kit took out the long white tunic from the bag and put it on. He also took out the stick and used it to strike a sheep in Jaja Kasumba's compound. The sheep died instantly. That same night, Sumuju was sleeping with other Ugandans in a tent in Juba when suddenly he woke up craving banana beer. Wondering if something could have happened to the kit, Sumuju called his wife in Kampala the next morning, told her to bathe with herbs and to check his kit to see if his friend had tampered with it. When she looked, she found that all of the money in the bag was gone. Distraught and late to work, Sumuju got dressed and went to where the trucks were offloading the daily shipment from Kampala. As soon as he arrived, one of the truck owners told him that he didn't need him anymore, that he had gotten someone else. Then the other called to give him the same news. He was suddenly and inexplicably jobless. He called Jaja Kasumba for help, and when he heard the story, Jaja Kasumba went and questioned the friend who had been keeping the kit. Upon finding that the friend had indeed tampered with the kit, Jaja Kasumba chased the friend from the compound. With no job, Sumuju decided to return to Uganda. Before boarding the bus home, he used all of his remaining money to buy waraji, stuffing every pocket of his trousers with the plastic top packs of the potent spirit. When he reached Kampala, he was drunk and nearly unconscious. In the weeks that followed, Sumuju drank with abandon. Luckily, someone recognized him passed out in a ditch on the side of the road and carried him back to Jaja Kasumba's compound. Eventually, Sumuju was able to reassemble the kit, and once he did, he stopped drinking again. This was 2012, and since that time, he has not had problems with alcohol again. He makes sure to keep the gourds he has left for Bamoyana filled with beer and regularly lights fires for Chiwanuka. He is also starting to take up the training to become a leader of the community of Basamize himself. From time to time, he drinks a little beer or a little tonto, but only during rituals or other offerings, and it never causes him any problems now that he's settled his problems with Chiwanuka and Bamoyana. So what do we make of all this? For all their differences, and they are many, both Daniela and Sumuju understood their problems with alcohol to be the result of the workings of agents that were fundamentally other and external to themselves. As in Susan Reynolds White's work on the writings on the ways in which people confront misfortune in a neighboring area of eastern Uganda, the questions asked and the answers sought focus less on the introspective question, why me, than they do on the extrospective question, who are you, with the inquiring gaze focused on beings outside of the self. Further, as is also true in White's work, the question is not asked as a matter of abstract curiosity or even regret. Instead, is it a question asked in an effort to determine a course of action, in an effort to do something about those others that are impinging on their lives. For while a life may be shaped by the actions of spiritual others, there are concrete things that can be done, either to exercise the spirit on one hand or to repair and more productively attend to the relationship on the other. This way of understanding addiction differs substantially from the models put forward by Alcoholics Anonymous and the chronic relapsing brain disease model with regard to the question of permanence. In both the CRBD model and the AA model, addiction can be framed as something genetic or something acquired or some combination of the two, but whatever the cause, it is seen as something permanent. Had Daniela or Sumuju made their ways to the alcohol and drug unit at the National Psychiatric Hospital or to one of Kampala's newly founded AA groups, they would have likely been taught to see themselves as having a fundamental and unchanging condition. They would have likely to learn to identify as addicts, to see themselves as a particular kind of person. At Pastor John's, Daniela instead came to understand that her drinking was the result of the workings of a spirit who could only leave her through prayer, fasting, and a commitment to Christ. In learning to see herself in this way, Daniela was coming to an understanding of the influence of spiritual forces in this world that is sometimes known as spiritual warfare. The particular kind of spiritual warfare practiced at Pastor John's points towards a view of agency and moral culpability that frames behaviors like problem drinking as actions that are caused by the workings of demons that come from outside the self. While a person's actions might unintentionally create openings for non-human others to impact their lives or in the lives of other people related to that person, these non-human others can cause people to act in ways that quickly exceed their control and responsibility. The demons are fundamentally not me, and practitioners of this form of prayer believe that they can be defeated through ongoing prayer and intercession. At Jaja Kasumba's, Samuju came to understand his drinking as the effect of the actions of the Lubale spirit Chiwanuka and the Lubale spirit Bamoyana. While Samuju was bound to Chiwanuka through Chiwanuka's intergenerational tie to his family, Samuju's drinking was also not quite his own. It was neither disease nor moral failing, but rather a punishment inflicted on him by a possessing spirit for his neglect of his spiritual duties. By properly attending to Chiwanuka and Bamoyana, Samuju was freed from a form of drinking that had been inflicted on him, while at the same time deepening his ties to Chiwanuka in the hope of prospering through his care. Attending to these accounts of the ways in which God, Balubale, and other spiritual beings play significant roles in processes of ethical transformation and recovery has required that George, Sarah, and I contend with a series of difficult questions about both agency and ontology. In short, we've had to decide whether to write of beings like God, Chiwanuka, and Bamoyana as agents capable of influencing the world directly, or whether to write only about the effects of the beliefs and practices that people have constructed in relation to them. While many of our interlocutors are deeply committed to explanations that saw spiritual beings as responsible for a person's struggle with alcohol, as scholars, we are left to decide whether we will write about the effects of the way that the circle of responsibility is drawn, in the words of anthropologist James Laidlaw, or about the effects of the beings themselves. Over the course of the past 7 years of research and writing, we found ourselves pulled between these two modes of engagement. On the one hand, we seem to have found ready evidence for a classic anthropological argument about the rhetorical influence of ritual speech and about the human practices that kindle experiences into existence. Medical anthropologists have long held that symbols can be manipulated to produce transformative effects. In his 1963 essay, The Effectiveness of Symbols, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that the ritual use of language can both facilitate and express psychic states that are otherwise inexpressible and change our relationship to those states and to the tasks at hand. Recounting the use of a therapeutic chant among the Kuna of Panama, Lévi-Strauss showed how the process of immersing a woman in the midst of a difficult birth in a vivid symbolic landscape could radically alter her relationship to the distress and exhaustion that might be further slowing the birth. As the anthropologist Michael Jackson puts it in his discussion of that famous essay, quote, "The expressive value of the spell, which translates lived subjectivity into the objective language of myth, is linked to its instrumental purpose. For insofar as her experience of the situation is changed, the woman is better able to overcome the pain, distress, and exhaustion that are contributing to the difficult birth. It is in this inductive property of symbols," says Lévi-Strauss, "their power to induce or persuade us to think differently about our relationship to a task at hand or a situation in which we are experiencing great difficulty, that their effectiveness lies." For all their other disagreements, which are too numerous to detail here, anthropologists who have held as diverse viewpoints on the nature of social life and human being as Malinowski, Lévi-Strauss, and Jackson have all agreed that material and non-material symbols can have effects on people's orientations towards their experiences, and that these changed orientations have profound effects on experience itself and thus on people's capabilities of acting in the world. In learning to see their illnesses as the result of actions of spiritual beings, both Samuju and Daniela came to understand their situations and, perhaps more importantly, their capacities for action in a new way. As we can see in Samuju and Daniela's stories, this process of repositioning oneself in relation to illness is not an easy one, and it can take months or years to accomplish. But once embraced and symbolically engaged through ritual speech and action, these understandings of illness can have remarkable effects. In taking up this analytic, we can see how Samuju's ritual engagements with Chiwanuka and Bamoyana transformed his experience of the world and allowed him to approach the task of living a sober life with a different kind of energy and commitment. Just as the woman Levi-Strauss describes is reoriented towards her struggle with an obstructed birth, so is Samuju reoriented in his struggle with alcohol. Likewise, in understanding his relapse and the loss of his job as resulting from the destruction of the kit, the restoration of the kit becomes the means through which he can reorient himself to sobriety once again. While the actions of a spirit like Chiwanuka or Bamoyana might seem to be entirely beyond our control, the possibilities of influencing these actions through the ritual restoration of the Lubale kit offers a method of redress. There is now something to do that might have a kind of effect, and in this there is a new kind of hope, a new source for renewed strength. While such an interpretation might lead to deadly results in the case of appendicitis, if prayer and ritual were not accompanied by surgery, I want to argue that in the case of addiction, such an understanding might open up radically new pathways for engaging with one's future. Further, and perhaps more importantly, where people live in communities that recognize both the not meanness of problem drinking and the efficacy of ritual action, these ways of understanding the self and the capacity for transformation may also create different possibilities for the achievement of well-being through social connections. The fact that the people around Daniela at Pastor John saw her as fundamentally separable from the spiritual forces that had caused her to drink created important opportunities for building trusting interpersonal relationships. In short, the fact that her drinking was seen as having been caused by an agent that was both not her and separable from her afforded her a unique opportunity to begin again with her job and her new marriage. This pattern is strikingly different from that found at Uganda's inpatient recovery centers, where didactic trainings and group therapy sessions often foster forms of suspicion that can make truly trusting relationships difficult to achieve. While there were certainly tensions at Pastor John's and Jaja Kasumba's as well, seeing a person's past actions as authored by another seems to allow people there to form different kinds of relationships in the present. Such relationships of trust are further fostered through the creation of opportunities for demonstrating one's reliability and trustworthiness in progressively more public ways, such as Daniela's work at the security desk and then at the radio station. All of this said, we also take to heart Deepesh Chakrabarty's critiques of the disenchanted world of the social sciences and more recent writings of anthropologists who have identified with either the ontological turn or indigenous anthropologies, as these scholars provide us a path that allows us to perhaps think about how to more fully consider the world as our interlocutors did, and to note the gap between their understanding of the world and the model authored by Levi-Strauss that I've just described. In recent years, anthropologists have hotly debated the question of how we ought to treat the claims that others make about the nature of the world, particularly where these claims differ radically from those held by the anthropologists themselves or by the secular academy at large. Even among scholars who may not be deeply invested in the debates of the ontological turn, which are often quite circuitous and difficult to understand, the injunction to take seriously the claims that others make about the very nature of the world has begun to catch on in anthropology as a kind of political move, as a way of decolonizing anthropological practice. Embedded within this call is a claim that earlier scholars, like Levi-Strauss, were not taking the statements that people made quite seriously enough, and that in doing so, anthropologists were failing to consider the ways in which their concepts and politics might be transformed by a more serious engagement with the ontological claims of others. While the distinction between talking about how cosmology informs a given person's interpretation of experience and talking about ontology itself might seem abstract, it is in fact a deeply political distinction. Such ontological questions are no doubt foundational to, as what Stacy Langwick calls, the highly politicized and intimate battle over who and what has the right to exist. With such thoughts in mind, anthropologists have been trying to think more carefully about what sorts of violations we commit when we exclude various more than human beings from the stories that we tell and to find ways to bring them back into our texts. While I cannot resolve the tensions between these two approaches today, I do want to invite you all to think about what becomes possible and impossible, visible and invisible, as you shift between thinking about the effects of belief, ritual, and human sociality, and the effects of spiritual beings themselves. Finally, I want to close here by thinking a bit about the possible implications of this work for further research looking at the effects of engaging with forces described as not me or not you in places in the United States, where these ideas also have cultural salience. And this, in fact, is partly what I'm taking up in my work with my US-based collaborators, Joshua Burraway and Abigail Mack, in our study of opioid addiction and treatment in Virginia and Tennessee. While Chaganda spirit mediumship practices are not commonly found here, the ideas of deliverance and spiritual warfare being deployed by Ugandan Pentecostals and Catholic charismatics have emerged through a dialogue with Christians in the United States. While spirituality and mindfulness have to some degree been embraced as potential resources for healings in hospitals, the models of agency, temporality, personhood, and spirituality embraced by people like Daniela and people practicing spiritual warfare in the United States might make some scholars and practitioners uncomfortable. But I want to argue that it's worth sitting with this discomfort for long enough to learn what such models mean to those who hold them and what effects they have in their lives. Anthropologists like Angela Garcia have described the devastating stakes of disease models that only seem to replicate the melancholic chronicity of endless loss in places where life has been shaped by acts of dispossession for generations. Through our work in Uganda and in the United States, I hope to have found ways to build on her call to seriously consider the potentials contained within other modes of living in relation to time and addiction by watching addictions and their afters unfold in worlds that have not yet been completely colonized by the chronic disease model. Thank you.
See if I can balance this here. Yes, I can. Great. Oh. Let's go there. Okay, great. Okay. Always makes me nervous.
Me too.
Okay. And let me see if I've got this. Great. Okay, it's really a pleasure, although this is definitely the nadir of energy and awakeness in the afternoon. We've had lunch, it's the second day of the conference, everyone's tired. But I hope to just really present some thoughts about personhood, ethics, and addiction, building very much upon Dr. Scherz's talk. And also want to thank the Nicola Center for inviting me and for Dr. Scherz for the privilege of being able to respond to her talk. It's really wonderful to have these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do so. So this topic is of great interest to me. First, because I come from a Black Pentecostal background, and the Pentecostal story plays a significant role in Dr. Scherz's research. In second place, because there's a special place in my heart for Uganda. Let me see if I can find this. Yep. So this is my husband and I. My husband's here. I want to honor him. This is in Uganda, near Kampala. We've spent some time there, and he spent a fair amount of time there with South Sudanese refugees. And last year, in 2022, we traveled there again to work with African Renewal Ministries near Kampala. It's very interesting that Uganda and East Africa experienced an enormous, just really far-ranging revival in the 19th century, which had a very great impact and really, I think, paved the way for Pentecostalism to come in. So turning to the task at hand, I'm very grateful to Dr. Scherz for her, what I consider to be a ringing challenge to the contemporary orthodoxy regarding addiction models. and for her rigorous affirmation of both the human person and the role that the spiritual world has in our lives. You know, all of us would consider ourselves to be spiritual to one degree or another. When we begin to consider the spiritual world, what does that really mean? And also, as a fellow researcher, I want to commend her for the perseverance and dedication that you need to carry out this kind of challenging research over so many years. So kudos. So in Genesis 2:7, the Bible says, "And the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the earth, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." It's clear from this account that the human person from creation is made distinct from animals. God breathes into us the breath of life, the Spirit. The Spirit is not only invisible, immortal, and immaterial, it also comes from somewhere and someone outside of ourselves. So from the very start, humanity is distinguished based on something that was imparted to us by God. So as we consider addiction, we're looking at something that has a very long history. And Dr. Scherz has referenced Victorian addiction discourse, and there are very many images from that era, like this one, which is showing demon drink. The title of this is Demon Drink. And Dr. Scherz makes the important point that I'm sorry, hold on, let me go on, and here's another one. Because, of course, in the Victorian period, especially in England, gin was the drug of choice. And it was just a cause of just tremendous misery, poverty, violence, and so on and so forth. So the idea that the spiritual world, especially the demonic, has an impact on human beings goes much further back. For example, to Hieronymus Bosch, and I can't resist having these amazing paintings that he's done, but really, you know, showing, you know, this is some kind of a frog or a fish or something devouring a human being. And may look fanciful, but to anyone who's worked with people who are under demonic affliction, this is the world they live in. It is very real. And I want to emphasize that. I'm a scientist, I'm a physician, I'm a researcher, but the reality of the spiritual world, I mean, the spiritual world is very real. We ignore it, we discount it, we scoff at it, but this is really a fact that spiritual entities do torment human beings. And like, as I said, we laugh at this picture and it looks kind of fanciful, but to those who are being tormented in the modern day, these are very real. And Dr. Scherz makes the important point that for both the Pentecostal Christians and the Basamize in Uganda, addictions are literally a loss of control. If any of you know addicts, you know that that is characteristic of that behavior. It is a loss of control, and there's no amount of reasoning, there's no amount of talking, there's no amount of therapy that will get them to come out of that simply by those discussions. That doesn't work. They are a type of spiritual bondage that controls a human being and their behavior, and how each tradition addresses these is quite different. For the Pentecostals, it's deliverance or exorcism, and then for the Basamize, it's pacification, deeper identification. So Dr. Scherz goes on to say that these differ in their moral valences and how humans should deal with them. I do want to emphasize that I'm not accepting a dualistic view. All right? I'm not saying that this is good and evil in a contest of equal power. I don't believe that that's true at all. But in any event, I find that the studies that she's presented of recovery and its implications are extremely compelling. Why? Well, first of all, I note with interest the very high alcohol consumption amongst Ugandans who drink. And in the Monitor, which is an East African newspaper, it quotes the executive director of one of the mental health hospitals in Uganda saying alcohol is the primary struggle for most of our clients. So think of a mental hospital where most of the people, in fact, she says 65% of them are admitted because of alcoholism. So that's really the number one cause of mental illness and admissions in this hospital. So the implications of this study's exploration of these potentially more effective therapeutic pathways to recovery are significant. Let's see. No, stay here. And as I noted earlier, Dr. Scherz's description of these pathways is a challenge to the current orthodoxy, to the biomedical model, because it emphasizes personhood, number one, but also it's the needed contribution to understanding how you overcome addiction. So Dr. Scherz notes that the different heuristics of the human person she describes have in common the effects of things in persons from outside of the human person. They're not described in secular nomenclatures. To the contrary, they're often denied because they run counter to the current secular materialistic worldview, as well as a modern view of the atomized, self-actualized self as autonomous, self-sufficient, and independent of other persons and beings. And in my opinion, I think you can argue effectively this is a delusion. None of us is completely independent of anything else. And it's all the more reason why we need a refutation of the buffer itself. And in fact, what you see in the terminal stages of addiction, I thought this just came to me, is that the addict considers that the only things existing in their world are themselves and the drug. Everything else fades out of existence. It's just them and the drug. And that's the ultimate sort of autonomous delusion, I would say. And it's another reason that we need this refutation of the buffer itself, which is proposed by Taylor, which is disengaged from, and that buffer itself is disengaged from the spiritual and relational worlds. Now, as a clinician and someone who's cared for many patients with addictions, this statement that current models fall short is very true. The shortcomings of our current models consign patients to a lifetime of dependence on the medical system or its appendages. And in a sense, sometimes it seems that dependence is being transferred directly, in the case of methadone therapy, for example, or indirectly through models emphasizing that the person is forever an addict to the medical system. And as a Pentecostal, I've seen the reality of the unseen spiritual world, including good spirits and evil spirits, and its ongoing battles. I've also seen addicts completely set free by the power of God, and it's my conviction that we cannot and should not ignore this reality, though it's easier and more comfortable to do so. And then perhaps because of the theory of the porous self acknowledges there are forces and beings beyond one's control, and therefore this is a threatening realization, it may be the case that this model is something that people want to avoid. In any event, Dr. Scherz correctly points out that since the 1990s, addiction has increasingly been seen as a chronic disease, an inescapable problem that can be managed and never cured. This is not only, in my opinion, capitulation, it signifies an erosion of the recognition of human dignity. Such a viewpoint is also antithetical to a scriptural view of the human person, which presents humans as having free will and the ability to make choices, to be redeemed and transformed through the power of God and faith in the work of Christ. I might add that we should also not abandon the role of will and morality in addiction, because what we see is that as the human will is weakened by sin and addiction, the likelihood that spiritual forces, evil spiritual forces, begin to control it begins to increase. The view that the addicted brain, and I really appreciated this quote, is distinctly different from the non-addicted brain likewise calls to mind the AA concept of terminal uniqueness. The destructive view that addicts and their problems are so different from those of other people that no one else understands them and the rules don't apply to them. Likewise, the idea of stigma, even though stigma serves an important purpose, is important, because stigma serves an important purpose in protecting other human beings in society from behavior that is exploitative or destructive. The real harm of stigma is not necessarily what people think of a person, but what they think of themselves, the self-stigmatization that people learn to identify and label themselves as addicts. Indeed, the very phrase hijacked brains implies a passivity, helpless submission being taken control of. Submission is something that cannot be resisted. None of these schemata correlate with my clinical experience or that of friends and others who have successfully conquered addiction. AA has been documented to be effective in helping folks with addiction achieve recovery, but I think that Dr. Scherz does a service in pointing out the problem with AA's premise that an alcoholic person is in a, quote, unchangeable condition. So going back to how Ugandan Pentecostals in Basamize approach alcoholism, I would like to note that at least in Christianity, ritual itself is not effective. Rather, it is the power that makes freedom possible. For an explicit example of this and why and how the ministry of deliverance differs from pure ritual, you can see Acts 19:13 through 17, where the sons of Sceva attempt to cast out a demon and are unsuccessful in doing so. It's worthwhile for you all to look up the scripture, Acts 19:13 through 17. I'm trying to stay on time. But essentially, they attempt to cast out a demon, are unsuccessful in doing so, and the demon responds to them and says, Paul I know, Jesus I know, but who are you? And so the sons of Sceva were sons of priests. They had ritual and pedigree, but they were powerless against demonic power. And it's poignant to me that, as Dr. Scherz writes, both secular and religious scholars scoff at the accounts of both Pentecostals and Basamize. Poignant because human beings in bondage long for freedom. Addicts, in their most difficult moments, recognize that they feel trapped. Why am I doing this? And because people can be dedicated either to good or to evil, to good spirits or evil spirits, and demonic oppression and possession are a reality. But I feel that it's a blow for freedom, as Dr. Scherz asserts, that these concepts point to the possibility of release, and I say yes to that. Daniela's story is very compelling, not unlike circumstances where I've seen people who are delivered from bondage to addictions. It's also compelling because when I see this pattern, this is a little incidental, children and young adults begin to use alcohol or drugs early in their lives. It almost always points to child or young adult sexual abuse. She achieves victory through a deeper commitment to God. Her prayer to him is the addicted one's cry for freedom. And after decades of experience, I and other colleagues have concluded that this is where true recovery starts. The process of Daniela being set free shows that deliverance and exorcism is a modern-day ministry of the church. And I don't want to lose the emphasis on relationships. As part of the quest for healing, the human person seeks relational healing. And one of the health systems I worked in worked with large numbers, the VA worked with large numbers of people in addiction, and we would talk about the fact that relational problems underlie a lot of issues with addiction. Likewise, community and its relationship to personhood has a powerful impact on her recovery. As Daniela comes to realize, we have moral responsibility and culpability. And so while alcoholism is in part a spiritual problem, it's not just the work of demonic spirits, but of sin. It creates those openings that Dr. Scherz mentions. And human agency alone is insufficient. In contrast, Sumuju achieves recovery through the young man that Dr. Scherz describes, achieves recovery through increasing his engagement with ancestral and other spirits. He's being punished by evil spirits, which he must placate in order to avoid relapsing into alcoholism. As long as he placates these spirits, he will not suffer from alcoholism. And it's important to look at that. Is that another kind of dependency or not? I was very interested in the tension that Dr. Scherz speaks of between writing about whether the spiritual world influences the natural world or whether it's the beliefs that are important. And I would say both are important, although I'd look a bit differently because I don't think it's necessarily the symbols that are manipulated by human beings, but spiritual beings, either evil or good, who are interacting with the human person. And where this tension centers perhaps is in the seat of human agency, which is the human will. And I would argue that the two examples demonstrate this. In Daniela's case, submitting to God and receiving deliverance and freedom, or with Sumuju entering more fully into the world of spirits. So I mentioned above, as I'm starting to close here, and I'm on time, wow. The role of the human will, and my husband would say, yes, she's on time. And I think that there's so much to say, there's always so much to say. The tension between the approaches that anthropologists use as far as claims regarding the nature of the world can be partly examined through a consideration of the role of human will. And I would submit that when dealing with spiritual oppression or possession, belief, ritual, and social relationships can help support those struggling with addiction and point them towards freedom, but ultimately, we have to acknowledge that spiritual beings can and do affect us. And freedom, which is completed recovery, not just recovery, but completed recovery, can occur decisively because of the work of Christ. So this is just like kind of a funny slide that I saw. So I want to close by acknowledging the discomfort that many in academia feel, as Dr. Scherz mentions, related to discussions of evil spirits, possession, and delivery and exorcism. I'm very appreciative that she's taken a courageous stand in not only arguing about the need to move beyond this, to, in a sense, even embrace that discomfort. Why am I uncomfortable with this? But also to begin to extend this work to the United States. Because people say, well, that's happening over in dark Africa, where people are like living in trees and doing all these evil spirits and things like that. But the fact that yes, we need to acknowledge this is an issue in the United States as well, and to understand this new model, which I believe has so much incredible potential. And again, I'm going to say it again, in both the Catholic and Protestant traditions, the ministries of exorcism and deliverance are part of the present-day work of the Church. So I'm thankful for the opportunity that Dr. Scherz has provided to consider both the Christian academic approach, what has been called the intellectual armaments of the Church, as well as the ministry of the Church to recovery and freedom in understanding better models for helping those struggling with addiction. Thank you.
Let's now open the floor to questions. We have a microphone marshal here, so just raise your hand and we'll get to you.
Thank you both so much. I'm Margot Wang. I was raised in a charismatic ecumenical background here in South Bend. I'm Catholic, go to school at an evangelical Protestant school. So my question is, and my family ended up leaving this charismatic church. So my question is whether in your research, if you've seen the sort of extrospective and transcendent agency for addictions cause issues for people who can't put the bottle down. The framework that I've heard, which makes a little bit of sense to me for the people for whom the exorcisms don't work or for whom the healing doesn't come, is that the successes are they're signs for the kingdom to come more than they are guaranteed. Like, yeah, the kingdom in its fullness isn't here, and so we can't expect for every case of cancer, every broken limb to be healed. But when they are healed, it's a sign for the kingdom that it's real. But I also recognize that some of the language, and maybe some of our generation, we've recognized the sort of agency put on other causes can be harmful. So I'm just wondering if you've seen that in your research.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. It's Margot. Yeah, thank you so much. So here I'm going to speak a little bit more about the US-based project than about the Uganda project, because it's just come up more poignantly there of, you know, people that we know who have gone through experience of deliverance and are now doing really well, have friends and even siblings in their lives who are continuing to struggle. And this question of why am I okay and my brother's not? And he went to church and he's still struggling. And so I think the explanation that you offer there is exactly what they offer as well in this moment, which is that, you know, this isn't a healing that you sort of come in, you do the prayers, and you're good to go, and you're out. That there is a kind of divine agency in this, and we don't know why God acts for one and not for another, and that this can be a real source of questioning, not so much of the questioning of sort of the existence or power of God, but, you know, why not this one? Why not now? Also, when people ask me questions about the efficacy of this, they're like, what's more effective? Is it this thing or that thing? We actually spent a long time talking to researchers in biostatistics, figuring out if there would be a way to create a case control model for this that we could actually scale to sort of have some sense of comparative efficacy. But it turns out you cannot randomize people into spirit possession and deliverance. There's no way to do that. And it would be unethical. It would be very unethical to do it. And so there is a sort of sense that this is something that is outside of our control. But I think in that, particularly for some of the groups I've worked with in the U.S., there's a kind of peace in that as well, is to be able to say, like, this is in God's hands. I can't control it. I can stand here. I can pray. I can act in the ways that God is asking me to act in this moment in relation to care for this person. And in that, maybe there's a little bit more peace than, you know, maybe we need to try this or that or the other. But it's a great question, Margot. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Steve O'Neill. I'm a physician here in Indiana. I don't take care of addiction, but I take care of a lot of people who suffer from addictions. And initially, I was a little bit skeptical when I started hearing your talk, but this was one of the most beautiful talks I've heard at this conference over the last few days. And, you know, in our healthcare system, there's a perverse incentive, I think, to keep people sick, to be chronically ill. And I don't know if there is necessarily a motivation for cure but more of a sustaining people the way they are. And I think that's something that we fight against here. We treat them and get them out of the hospital, get them out of the ER, and then they wander around and show up in another emergency room or something like that. And their problem is never solved, and we continue to look down on them from our poor perspectives that we have gained over the years of cynicism, I think. And what I want to ask is, within this system in the US, there's two questions. How do we introduce more of this spiritual aspect into the healing of people in a very secularized healthcare system whose payment processes, et cetera, are not oriented towards something like this? We still look at other mental illnesses or mental illnesses as something that we still don't want to address completely. And the second question is, how do we balance the true agency of the individual? I personally don't think we can put it all off onto spiritual forces. I think there's a tremendous amount of spiritual forces, but just like in diabetes, for instance, it's not the patient's fault that they have diabetes, but it may be their fault if they don't take their insulin. And so how do we balance the agency of the individual with the spiritual aspect?
It's a great question. I wonder, Monique, do you want to take a first shot at that as an actual clinician?
Oh, this is working. Yeah, this is something that I've been sort of thinking about for very many years, in a long time. I think that the idea of human agency is extremely important. And when we go to pray for someone to be set free, that's the first question we ask. Do you want to be free? And even Jesus asked someone, what did they want? If someone does not want to be free, and you'd be surprised at the number of people who don't want to be free, there's really nothing you can do. But the whole process of someone being set free is not, bam, you get hit by Holy Spirit lightning and you're fine. It's a process of discipleship, and it's a process of submission to God's will, along with the power of the Spirit to deliver them. Now, the people in our medical system, I think to a certain extent, as physicians, as Christians who are physicians, operating in these systems, we can participate in that process. But this is where I think the role of the church becomes extremely important, because we are under so many pressures to deal with so many things that I think that partnership with the church, where the church is able to fully embrace and develop relationships, because one of the reasons that I have found that addicts engage in addictive behavior is that when they have a relational need, they go to the drug instead of another human being. That's a huge issue for a lot of addicts. So it's a process of understanding, no, instead of going to the drug, yeah, okay, you've been set free, but you still have those habits. You still have those ingrained habits. And so that's where I think bringing the church into the conversation in a very deliberate and well thought out way is, as well as those of us who are Christians, who are physicians, bringing it in that way as well, is what we need to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think also maybe one way that it can come into the clinical encounter is trying to find spaces within the 15-minute visit or whatever you have that's even a sayable thing. I can think of my own experiences of going into medical settings, and there's certain things that I'm going to tell my clinician and certain things that I'm not going to tell them, and I have to sort of wall off some piece of myself so that this encounter runs smoothly to try to figure out, are there ways in which we could reshape medical dialogue so that this is something that is sort of sayable and discussable as something that is possibly useful. And then I think the relational piece is so key. I think one of the things I think about a lot in Daniela's story is that she was living at the church for years. There are not a lot of spaces in American churches where someone who is still actively using substances could hang out and sleep for 2 years as they waited for something to shift. And so the sense that you could be in relationship and be in a relationship of care prior to the change rather than only after, I think is really important for thinking about how we do relationship around people with a whole wide range of challenging problems.
Good.
Hi, my name is Aviva Lund. I just graduated from Notre Dame this last spring. I studied neuroscience and behavior, and I'm now working for Optimal Work, a company founded by Dr. Kevin Majors, a Catholic psychiatrist at Harvard. And so my question is the following. So do you think that habituation and encouragement towards self-sacrificial relationship is enough to respond to stronger demons of addiction, or do you think there is a need for an explicit reference to God and spiritual beings? I'll kind of like sidestep, explain kind of some context to my question. In our work, we use reframing mindfulness and challenge as a way to respond to anxiety and addiction. So being comfortable with the urge that you're experiencing, whether it is in the anxiety or in your experience of addiction, and responding with that in deliberate action and mindfulness, and seeing the larger opportunity for growth and doing so in community. And so, again, pointing back to my question, I mean, I'm already confident this can work in daily situations, but I'm curious about when it comes to stronger demons, if this is sufficient, or if it's needed to name the evil spirits present?
Well, I don't have a great answer to that because I haven't studied that, precise intervention. So I don't think it's impossible that it could be helpful. I think one of the things that's important that I think this work speaks to, and really the larger book that sort of tracks across all of these different therapeutic modalities, is there's lots of things that can be helpful and that can work and that work for different people more and less well. I think the Ugandan context